Guys, you're joining us right here at the tail end of Orca Action Month 2022, which was a lot of fun. And we're really grateful that you all decided to join us this evening. I know the sun's been out this week at least, but with our Orca Action Month theme this year being streamed to sea and kind of going through the entire range that the southern residents forage throughout, we did want to come up with something actionable at the end of the month to bring everybody together, to celebrate over, but to give you, a little bit of homework at the end here. I do want to let you guys know I am probably going to turn my video off. I'm going to be the one thumbing through our slideshow presentation, and my internet likes to constantly tell me that I'm unstable. So because I keep getting that message this evening, I will probably turn my video off, not to be rude. There's going to be great things to look at and talk about anyway. And I think before we jump into everything, I wanted to just take a minute to run through our panel of speakers here tonight. So Cindy, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I'm Cindy Hansen. I'm the Education and Advocacy Coordinator for Orca Network. Monica?
I'm Monica Whelan-Shields, the director of the Orca Behavior Institute and part of the Bold Action Coalition that's helping sponsor this event tonight. Colleen?
Hi, everybody. I'm Colleen Weiler. I'm the Jessica Ricos Fellow for Orca Conservation with Whale and Dolphin Conservation.
Awesome. And I'm Amanda Colbert. I'm on the Orca Action Month coordination team, and I'm the education and outreach individual for the Salish Sea School, also joining you through the Bold Coalition this evening. So without further ado, I am going to share my screen here and give us a chance to kind of get started. See how this goes.
Yeah, so our goal for tonight is to, as Amanda said, kind of close out Orca Action Month with a call to action with a timely public comment period that's open right now. And our goal is to really, give you some science background about why this issue is relevant to the southern residents and the prey that they depend on. Sort of orient you a little bit in the timeline and the process, because we hear a lot about the Snake River dams and sort of how does this comment period fit into the, the bigger picture and this advocacy effort. And then also run through some suggested talking points and just general advice for your public comment letters. So that'll be our goal this evening, and we'll kind of have all of our panelists give a short presentation. We'll have plenty of time for any of your questions and hopefully some discussion at the end as well. So I'm going to kick things off here with some of our Orca science, and really that's why we're all here. Amanda, if you just want to go to the next slide there. We're all here for Orca Action Month. And so how does this tie in directly to the southern residents? Well, the southern residents often kind of get the misnomer of being Puget Sound orcas or Salish Sea orcas, when in reality, they rely on coast-wide Chinook salmon abundance. And, as a result, we need to really advocate throughout their range for recovery of the prey that they depend on. And NOAA's recovery plan for the southern residents really emphasize the importance of the Columbia Snake River Basin by saying that perhaps the single greatest change in food availability for resident killer whales since the late 1800s has been the decline of salmon in the Columbia River Basin. So while we also need to talk about issues like the Klamath and the Fraser River, really the Columbia Snake River Basin is a huge historical component for the diet for all three southern resident pods. And as they've been spending less time in their core summer habitat and more time on the outer coast, the importance of the Columbia Snake River Basin to their diet is probably increasing. When they're on the outer coast, they are still encountering fish that are returning to the Fraser River, but they probably are having a greater opportunity to encounter Chinook that are returning to the Columbia Snake River Basin as well. So this is probably as the Fraser is struggling, the Columbia fish are perhaps of even greater importance. Next slide. So we know that the coastal habitat use is kind of different by pod. Traditionally, J-pod is sort of the most resident of the 3 pods in the Salish Sea. They're here usually every month of the year. And when they do go to the outer coast, they tend to stay near the western end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca or head north kind of into BC waters. But for K and L pods, they head south and will utilize the outer Washington coast, Oregon coast, and California coast. And probably, the Columbia Snake River fish are even more important to Ks and Ls than they are to J-pod. And the critical habitat for the southern residents was expanded to include this outer coastal range from kind of central BC down to central California. And a lot of the data that informed that critical habitat expansion also is critical in showing the link between the Columbia Snake River fish and the southern resident killer whales. So for tagging data, when the southern residents were satellite tagged, this graphic on the right here is sort of a heat map that was a modeling result based on the tags of the K and L pod whales that occurred on the outer coast. And the result of this occurrence model showed that for K and L pods, more than 40% of their time on the outer coast was right between Grays Harbor and the mouth of the Columbia River. So just based on where they're occurring, there's a strong link between where they spend their time on the outer coast and where they're most likely to encounter Chinook that are returning to the Columbia Snake River Basin. Additionally, there was a recent paper published by Hansen et al. In 2021 that was looking at what exactly they were feeding on the outer coast, looking at both prey samples and fecal samples. And while their diet is more diverse in the winter compared to the summer, Chinook still makes up more than half of their diet year round. And of the prey samples that were collected on the outer coast, using genetic identification of scales of the fish, they can determine which specific stock the fish that the whales were eating belonged to. And over 50% of those outer coast prey samples came from Chinook salmon that returned to the Columbia Snake River Basin. So that's another really key point showing that, yes, they're feeding on fish that return to a wide variety of rivers throughout the coast. But when Ks and Ls are in that key area between Grays Harbor and the Columbia River, more than half of the Chinook they're eating are from the Columbia Snake River Basin. And the final kind of piece of recent science that points to the importance of this region to these whales is the passive acoustic monitoring detections of the southern residents. There's an outer coast hydrophone array that goes from the western end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca down, past the mouth of the Columbia River. And this is important data because it gives us a broader picture. The satellite tags were only a couple of whales and were fairly short in duration. The prey samples, again, while that's really key data, there's a fairly small number of samples, but through acoustic monitoring, we get a much larger picture of, throughout the entire year. And every month of the year, every day of the month, if the southern residents are detected in a particular area. And the southern section of that hydrophone array, which coincides with that Grays Harbor to mouth of Columbia region, they found peak southern resident killer whale acoustic detections on those hydrophones exactly during the months that coincide with the return of spring Chinook to the Columbia River Basin. So again, through satellite tagging, through prey samples, through acoustic monitoring of where the whales are when they're on the outer coast, all of these recent scientific studies are just contributing to our, increasing knowledge of how important these fish are to the southern residents. All right, Amanda, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Monica. So I thought I would dive into the history of salmon abundance. So roughly 200 years ago versus present numbers today. How did we get to this point with salmon being this far in decline? Of course, there's an obvious answer to that, but why the dams were built in the first place, why are they necessary, some of the major services that these dams provide people. And then I also kind of provide a visual explanation of the hydro systems in the Columbia snake, and then why they do negatively impact wild salmon so much. So jumping into salmon history in the Columbia snake, it was estimated that 10 to 16 million wild salmon and steelhead entered the Columbia River system, with an additional 2 to 4 million in the Snake River watershed, and that was annually. The Columbia River Basin was once home to the largest returns of Chinook salmon. And like I mentioned, that was roughly 200 years ago. So today we're looking at a pretty different story. We've got less than 1 million wild fish returning to the Columbia River and fewer than 60,000 wild fish returning to the snake each year. Currently, all salmon species that use the snake are listed as threatened or endangered. So to kind of get into, what happened before we get into the dam picture, there was a big establishment of salmon canneries that happened in 1867, and that was the first cause of decline in wild salmon populations. So in 1879, it was reported that over 500,000 salmon were caught and canned in a single season. And at the turn of the century, basically what happened is that was causing some widespread concern for catch rates, and that caused the people of Oregon to pass laws limiting fishing in the Columbia and other rivers. But of course, as we know, there were other major modifications to the Columbia and Snake that were in progress in the form of dams and hydro systems established to aid basically in economic development of the east side, where it's very arid in that portion of our state. And dams along the Columbia River and Snake were put in place basically to generate power for energy. In certain places along that water basin, it does provide flood control mechanisms. And it also provides some irrigation options for farming and agricultural practices where water was pretty much otherwise unavailable, but the soil was pretty rich for growing. And then if we look at some of the areas that were created around the stagnant reservoirs right behind these dams that were put in place, tourism and some recreational opportunities were something else that cropped up. So where are the 4 lower Snake River dams? Before we hop into that, I don't know how many people have actually spent some time looking at how large the water basin for both the Columbia and the Snake are. And to kind of understand that, we have the Columbia here, coming in through Portland and then turning north, actually going all the way up into BC. Whereas right here at the Tri-Cities, you guys will see this giant fork that takes place, and the Snake is right here. It's the largest tributary river that comes off of the Columbia, or would, in other terms, joins right here in this area before pushing fresh water out to the Pacific. So if we were looking at the key here, we're talking about these 4 dams in red. That just means that these dams are owned and operated by the Corps of Engineers. And if we're looking at all of these little yellow ones, they're dams owned by other people, whether privately or organizations. And a few key points about this in here are, after the cannery situation where we were already losing salmon pretty quickly, we transitioned into the 1930s and 70s when the dams were being built along the Columbia and then eventually in portions of the Snake as well. And as you can see by all the red and yellow dots, there are many dams in this river system. In fact, on average, there's a major dam about every 72 miles. So if you guys look closely too at a couple of these that are circled, we have impassable dams with no fish passage in them whatsoever, meaning that the upper reaches of the Columbia and then the eastern reaches of the Snake are basically completely impassable by salmon. So it's a habitat that's been completely lost to salmon. All of the other dams kind of along the Columbia here and then switching over into the Snake pose their own challenges, but they do provide some sort of fish passage or ladders that help adult spawners get into the river system. But, just because they can navigate past those dams doesn't mean that it's easy. So the 4 federal dams that are managed by the Army Corps of Engineers on the Lower Snake, they are indeed built with fish ladders for returning adult salmon, but our out-migrating juveniles, which are also known as smolts, really do have a pretty treacherous journey out-migrating. So they've got to navigate through this series of hydro systems. There's dam turbines, there's sluiceways, those stagnant reservoirs I talked about that might be good for recreation are not good for migrating salmon. There's definitely warming waters in those areas, contaminants that have built up, and then we have some pretty smart predators that know where to hang out for those juvenile salmon before they can reach the Pacific Ocean. So I did a little digging before I jumped on this webinar. I kind of wanted some concrete numbers on, what this equation looks like with the Lower Snake and without. And per Northwest Steelheaders, I was reading that each interaction that a juvenile salmon has with a dam reduces their chance of returning to spawn in the Columbia River system as an adult by 10%. So if we look at the 4 along the Columbia here that our Snake River salmon have to go through, and the 4 on the Snake itself, and we do some 10% times 8 math, these out-migrating juvenile salmon only have about a 20% chance on their way out of making it back into this river system as an adult to spawn, which is not a very high number at all. So in turn, removing the Lower Snake dams will remove half of the major obstacles that are blocking fish migration to and from their spawning grounds. And if the massive barriers are removed, salmon and steelhead will have lower migration mortality rates. And what we hope that this does in turn is leads to a greater reproductive success, which would put wild runs on a trajectory for growth. In fact, based on some of the numbers I looked at for projections, it seemed that salmon returns are projected to more than double if the Lower Snake River dams were breached. I did want to point out real quick, even if juvenile salmon managed to reach the Pacific Ocean against all these odds that I'm mentioning, there are a few things that fish biologists and scientists have been studying along the Columbia and Snake River in the smolts that are out migrating, and they have figured out that this hydro system, all the stressors that are experienced by these out migrating juveniles, could possibly cause some of these salmon a delayed mortality. And the reason behind that is their development is basically stunted or delayed, and then they're suppressing their immune systems. So more energy is basically being channeled into them surviving the system and making it out to the Pacific, instead of going through that natural change that should be happening to lead them to be ocean ready fish as they emerge into the Pacific. So when they enter the ocean in a weakened condition, it does increase the chance that these salmon could be susceptible to disease or parasites, and they may not fully adapt to the saltwater environment at all. So even if they make it downstream through all of this, they still might not become viable specimen in that ocean environment, which at the end of the day means they will not become accessible orca food. So after going, through all of this, it's pretty clear that the resulting hydro system complexities that I've kind of talked about here are highlighted for salmon along the Columbia and the Snake. Just basically means that dams and salmon don't mix. And so even though we're talking about this draft report tonight, that's coming up, which Colleen is going to get into the specifics for in this slide, that lets everybody know, not that any of you joining us tonight aren't aware, but there's obviously been numerous reports over the years that have come to the conclusion that dam breaching would provide the best chances for long-term recovery of Snake River salmon stocks. We've seen Washington State and the Bonneville Power Administration invest billions of dollars over the last 40 years. And yet we haven't seen anything really in the positive for our salmon, as most of the stocks are still threatened or in decline. And then real quick, I'm just going to kind of leave this up here for you guys. I'll walk you through key points of the history of litigation related to the Lower Snake River dams. And basically since 1993, states and environmental groups have sued NOAA over their biological opinions on the federal operation of the power system on the Columbia and Snake Rivers and associated impacts on endangered salmon. So you guys can see as we work our way down this line, there were several biological opinions. There were several key points of litigation that were related to those biological opinions, and then actions that came about in the process. Basically, when we get down here to about 2017 and 2018, the Columbia Basin Partnership Task Force convened, and they were trying to bring stakeholders together to develop goals for restoring salmon runs in the Columbia Basin. And it did include biological evaluation of proposals to breach the 4 lower Snake River dams. And then in 2018, we had the Southern Resident Orca Task Force, which I'm sure many of you followed along with. One of the resulting recommendations that came out of that process was to establish a stakeholder process that would help bring stakeholders together to discuss potential breaching of the 4 lower Snake River dams. So in 2020, that stakeholder engagement report that resulted from the Orca Task Force recommendation was completed. And then they evaluated the opinions of Washingtonians on the positive and negative impacts of potential breaching of these dams. Also in 2020, the Army Corps of Engineers released the Columbia River System Operations Final Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS. And while breaching was evaluated, the preferred alternative that this impact statement came up with did not include dam breaching in their final statement. Of course, the decision was challenged in court. Another great thing that happened in early 2021 was we finally had a politician in Idaho, Congressman Mike Simpson, that stood up and proposed the Columbia Basin Initiative. And he was basically the first elected official to publicly endorse breaching the lower Snake River dams to bring back our salmon populations. So in October of 2021, all parties involved agreed to pause current litigation until July of 2022, and it was to allow the development of a new comprehensive plan to restore Snake River salmon. What we're talking about tonight is led by Governor Jay Inslee and Senator Patty Murray, and it's a federal state process that will help determine whether there are reasonable means for replacing the services provided by the lower Snake River dams. So tonight, this report that we're going to go over is indeed what we're asking you to comment on, and this is just a draft of that plan so far. I'm going to let Colleen pick up on the rest.
Thanks, Amanda. So as she just summarized wonderfully, this plan, what we're referring to as the MURRAY-INSLEE report, really grew out of those 2 key task forces, the Columbia Basin Partnership, which outlined some specific recovery goals for salmon in the Columbia Basin, and the Southern Resident Task Force, which did have one recommendation to further examine Snake River dam removal. And it builds upon that previous survey that was conducted by the Washington Governor's Office. And this really came up also in response to that plan that came out of Representative Mike Simpson's office and the growing pressure on Washington elected officials to actually do something and move forward with looking at the Snake River dams. So this is baby steps forward and examining the details of the services that are provided by the dams and the if and how those services might be replaced. So if it is a possibility, and then examining the plans on how to do that and what it would cost. So the plan does integrate Representative Simpson's plan along with some other studies, including information from that 2020 Columbia River System Operations report. So it gives kind of a range of costs as well as how much it would cost to breach and replace the services by the dams. And as has been mentioned, this is currently a draft report. So there is room and time for input. This open public comment period is why we're here tonight. So now is the time to weigh in on any corrections, anything that the draft report may have missed, and to weigh in on that final recommendation. So this plan itself is not intended to be a yes or a no on dam breaching, but to be part of that bigger roadmap that will replace the services if they are breached and be part of that larger region-wide effort for salmon recovery that Amanda mentioned is the goal of pausing the litigation that is ongoing. Next slide. So what does the report say? Well, first of all, it recognizes that the status quo is not working for anyone. The report says change is inevitable 4 times. So it does recognize that something needs to change with how we operate dams and how they do or do not coexist with salmon in the Snake River Basin. And it notes that even with that range of costs that can seem very high, the dams themselves are already very costly to maintain and operate alone, not including the costs that were mentioned of mitigating the impacts to salmon. That's additional costs by Bonneville Power Administration. And they're only going to get more expensive over time as ongoing maintenance and upgrades are required over the continued lifespan of the dams. And as noted earlier, we know the science has shown that dam breaching is the best option to recover Snake River salmon. And this report reiterates that point, that this is the best thing to do to help with that salmon recovery, and pairs that with the fact that the services are replaceable. So this report shows that it's not just a thought exercise, it's something that can be done and provides the details on different options of how that would happen. Next slide. So certainly the biggest change required and the biggest cost is replacing the energy that's provided by the dams. And going back to one of that, change is inevitable and status quo does not work. The energy system in the Pacific Northwest is already fluctuating, and the contribution and capacity of the dams will be more uncertain into the future. So on average, right now, they produce about 940 megawatts per year, which is lower than their full capacity that they could produce, and is only about 11% of Bonneville Power Administration's entire system generation. Production, how much power is coming out of them, is really dependent on river flow. They're usually at the highest production in the late winter and early spring when we have snowpack coming down and melting, and there's a lot of water in the system. But in the Northwest, with climate change and with peak demands switching from the winter when people are heating their homes to the summer now when we need to cool things down a little bit more, the dams are not able to contribute as much. They don't have as much water available in the summertime. They're becoming less valuable to EPA's system overall. So paired with changes in demand when people are needing power, climate effects, also the shift towards decarbonization and lowering power use in general, changing legal structures, the Columbia River Treaty, which was mentioned earlier, BPA contracts are changing, and a change in regulatory and the policy landscape of both Washington and Oregon shifting towards more renewable energy sources. There's already going to be a lot of changes in the energy grid, and the dams are an obsolete, older method of getting power that we can and should move past. And then probably the second most important service and most regularly used service from the dams is barging. So through that navigation and transportation, the lock system from Lewiston, Idaho to the lower Columbia River ports. And again, the report found that this is something that can be replaced. Barging already shifts to rail and road when the locks fail or are undergoing maintenance, and there are seasonal needs and peaks. So it's not a consistent, there's lots of goods moving on the barges at all times. It's something that ebbs and flows, and with investments and planning, it can be replaced by better rail and road infrastructure. Next slide. And those two other services, agricultural and irrigation, the report still finds, once again, that this is a service that has an alternative. It's something that can be replaced by deepening the ground wells and improving the pumps from getting water from the river to the farms that rely on it for irrigation. And then looking at historical water levels, it suggests that even if the dams and the relatively small reservoirs were taken out. The historical water levels are still sufficient to keep all of the farms that depend on the river going. And as far as tourism and recreation, that is kind of it's replaced with a different form of those things. So once again, it is something that can be replaced, but all of the essential elements are still primarily there. People use the reservoirs in the river for boating, for rafting, and for fishing, and all of those things can be done on a free-flowing river. The biggest change to that would be cruise ships, which currently travel from Portland up to Lewiston, Idaho, would not be able to complete that journey because they couldn't go through the locks. But again, that is there are options and alternatives available for that. Next slide. So as important as it is to note what the report says, it is also important to say what it doesn't say. So the report does not conclude that it's too expensive and it's not worth dam breaching. It doesn't say that it's impossible and that the services cannot be replaced. And it doesn't say that it won't recover salmon. The report is very clear that dam breaching offers the best future and the best way to recover salmon in the Snake River. And some of the other things missing are certainly the underrepresentation of how important Snake River salmon are to southern resident orcas. As Monica covered, there is plenty of science and information that indicates just how essential these runs are. And it doesn't really include a lot of information in that report. Just generally, the report is really missing the ecological costs and impacts of the dams. It discusses a little bit of the economic cost in terms of lost recreational value of fisheries and other river-based activities, the cultural loss to tribes through the loss of salmon and access to important sites, but it doesn't consider how the decline of salmon and the loss of a healthy, functional river has had additional costs on every aspect of the watershed and on the southern resident orcas. So to sum up, the big takeaways are that you can replace the benefits and the services provided by the dams. And it is something that, there's a significant economic benefit as well, because they are going to cost more to maintain, to upgrade. We're going to keep spending money on salmon recovery, and it is possible to spend that money on changing the river system instead and expand regional opportunities for a more economically diverse future. And next slide, and now I will hand it over to Cindy Hansen with the Orca Network to talk about how to put all of this into a comment letter.
Great. Thank you so much to the three of you for that great background. I'm also going to turn off my video because I'm unstable, just like Amanda. All right, so what we wanted to do, you've got a lot of great background information now, and we just kind of wanted to give you some tips on how to write your comments. And I will let you know that we are creating a guide. Some of you have seen our bold guides in the past, and we are creating one on this that we're hoping to get out soon, hopefully this weekend or early next week, that will have a lot more detail about what we're talking about tonight. So that hopefully will help you with your comments. And also I'll mention that there are other webinars going on with other organizations about this very issue. And we are primarily focusing on the southern residents tonight, but if you want more information on some of the other aspects of this, please join some of those other webinars, and then you can get some more information to add into your comment letters. All right, so as far as how to write an effective comment letter, and this is just kind of general, you can use this for any kind of a comment letter. So go ahead, Amanda, with the first one. First one is be respectful and polite. This in particular has obviously been a difficult and frustrating issue for a number of years, but you'll always get your point across much better by being direct, but polite. And then the next one is clearly and concisely state your ask at the beginning and again at the end. So tell them what you want, include whatever other information that you want to include, and then repeat your ask at the end. The next one is if you're including any scientific data, and you don't have to do that, but if you choose to do that, make sure you cite your sources. So make it clear to them that you've done your homework and you know the issue and you know what you're talking about. Also, use your own words rather than copying and pasting. If they receive 1,000 letters that all have exactly the same message, they count that as one comment. So make your voice count, make it unique, and use your own words in that. You can certainly take suggestions that people are giving you, but just try to word it a little bit differently. And then the other thing you can do is make it personal. You know, elected officials are people too, and they know that these are sometimes emotional issues that they're dealing with. So include a narrative about what this issue means to you and why it's important. So those are some general suggestions on how to write effective comment letters. And now we kind of want to go into kind of some specific suggested talking points for this particular letter. And these are suggestions. You don't have to include all of these. You can kind of do the postcard version by stating what you want them to do, adding a little bit of information, or you can go into a letter that goes into more detail. It's completely up to you, but these are just kind of some suggestions that you can use. So first of all, thank Governor Inslee and Senator Murray for their efforts. This has been a long time coming. Again, it may have taken a lot longer than we would have liked. It's been frustrating, but it's pretty monumental that we're here at this place right now. And a thank you for their efforts may go a long way. I want to make sure everybody understands, I know Colleen mentioned this, the decision they're making is not whether or not to breach the dams. They don't actually have the authority to do that. They're deciding whether to recommend dam breaching. And if they do, obviously that decision isn't going to be popular with everybody in the state. So what they don't need is for everybody at the state mad at them. Some of them for making the recommendation and some of them for not doing it soon enough. So now is the time to kind of come together, thank them for getting us this far, and really support them in making the right decision. Next, you can acknowledge the impacts of dam removal to dam-dependent communities. There are a lot of people out there who will be impacted if these dams come down. They're afraid of losing their way of life just as much as we're afraid of losing the orcas. For some of these people, they've never known a time without the dams. They've never known anything different. So be considerate, be sympathetic to that. These people are also constituents of Washington, and our elected officials represent them as well as they represent us. So the more we can kind of come together in a place of understanding, the easier we make it for Inslee and Murray to make the recommendation we want them to. You can also state your support for a comprehensive package that Colleen went through really well that will replace the services provided by the dams. It can be done, but you state that you care about these communities and you support a plan that will allow them to continue their livelihoods with as little disruption as possible, while also taking the bold steps necessary to recover the salmon these orcas depend on. And then, as Monica mentioned, you can summarize the science about the importance of Snake River salmon to southern resident orchids. And again, we're putting together a guide through the Bold Action Coalition. We'll provide a lot more detail on that, and we'll get that out to you as soon as you can, so you can incorporate that into your letters. But again, remember to put that in your own words. All right, next slide. So along those lines, you know, we know that these salmon are really, really important to the southern resident orcas. So remind Governor Inslee of his commitment to the southern resident orcas through the executive order 18-02, and that was the development of the Southern Resident Orca Task Force. He stated in his executive order that if southern residents were to become extinct, we would suffer an unacceptable loss to our environment, economy, and way of life. So remind him of that. This is a big step in that. There's a lot that needs to be done to recover these orcas, but this is a really important, vital step. And it's all part of that comprehensive plan to recover the orcas. You can also mention the economics behind this. As you heard a little bit already, billions of dollars have already been spent on salmon recovery, but the salmon are still declining. So obviously we need to try something different. Go ahead, Amanda, with the next one. And then funds invested in watershed restoration. These generate economic activity. And this is from the State of the Salmon Report. Basically, there would be jobs created by environmental consulting, habitat restoration, enhancement projects, conservation districts, recreation of a restored river is part of it as well. So by investing in restoration of these watersheds, you're generating economic activity. And then also the benefits of the dams are outweighed by the cost of keeping them. And this was from a report by Earth Economics and something Colleen touched on as well. They're just too expensive to maintain. And so replacing those would actually be more economically viable than keeping them. Next slide. And as we talked about earlier, include a personal story, include that personal narrative about why Southern residents are important to you. You know, our elected officials care about the orcas too, or we wouldn't be here. Governor Inslee has his own stories about the orcas. So don't be afraid to tell those stories and make it personal. You don't need to write like an entire essay on it, but talk about why you care about them. Or if there's an individual that you're particularly fond of, you know, go ahead and say that J22 and J38 are the most awesome whales on the planet. That's okay to do. Understanding that these are individual beings is really key to helping protect them. And that's kind of what they need to hear. And then urge them to take a bold stance and commit to bold action in support of salmon and orca recovery. The Klamath Basin Settlement Agreement provides a framework for what we're talking about here on how to come to an agreement for dam removal, but it does require buy-in from political leaders. So remind them of that with their buy-in, this can be done. And then go ahead, Amanda, with the next one. We know that we have endorsement from both Oregon and Idaho with Governor Brown and Representative Simpson. So it's time for Washington to join them and just really urge, again, kind of at the end of your letter, again, make your statement, urge them to take this bold action and recommend removal of these dams. All right, so I think that's it for me. Here's some information on how you can comment on this, and maybe we can just leave that slide up for a little bit and maybe open it up to questions or a dialogue. Do any of our other panelists have anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, one thing we didn't say is when comments are due. They are due by July 11th. So it's important to start thinking about these letters. We'll get that bold comment guide out to you in the next few days, but July 11th is the date to circle on your calendar. You can email these to the email address that's on the screen here with a specific subject line that they're requesting. And they also have an online comment portal where you can submit your comments.
Thanks, Monica. So I think at this point,